40 years, Massachusetts has had a right to shelter law, which requires the state to provide shelter to families with children as well as pregnant women, but not to homeless individuals. The law, unique to Massachusetts, is attracting a lot of attention right now because more and more people are seeking emergency shelter at a time when housing is in short supply across the state. According to reports, more than 5,600 families with children are living in state-funded shelters, which range from standalone facilities to motel rooms. In January, according to one press report, 388 families were living in Massachusetts hotels being used as shelters. The number of families had increased to 1,400 earlier this month. The state is reportedly spending $45 million a month to help families eligible for emergency assistance. Part of the reason demand for emergency shelter is outstripping supply is an influx of migrant families. Governor Moore Healey recently declared a state of emergency, urging the federal government to pass immigration reform and streamline the process for allowing immigrants to take jobs. Welcome to the Codcast. I'm Bruce Mohl of CommonWealth, and I'm joined by two guests, Representative Peter Durant, a Republican from Spencer who is currently running for a seat in the state Senate, and Evan Horowitz, Executive Director of the Center for State Policy Analysis at Tufts University. Representative, let's start with you. Take a few minutes to lay out what you think should be done.
Thank you, Bruce. Thanks for taking the time and having me on. I think this is a very complex issue that we're facing right now. It's something that we haven't really had to think about very often. And as you mentioned, it's been on the books for 40 years now. It's been on the books for a long time. But as we start to see these migrant families coming in, this situation has just spiraled kind of out of control. And so I think one of the things that we're seeing is that these types of policies, if not outright repealed, they need to be reviewed, and maybe it's just some simple fixes that we can go through, but we certainly have to take a hard look at what's happening here and the amount of money that this is costing the taxpayers of Massachusetts. You know, I think we're all compassionate, right? We all believe that we want to help our neighbors. We want to help those who quite frankly, want to come to this country. I think we can have substantive arguments on how they should come to the country and what services you should be provided. But that's part of where we're at today and what needs to be done to ensure that A, we're following the law, B, is the law appropriate, and C, is the effect of this law. I think in effect here in Massachusetts, we're seeing that this law is becoming, or at least it has the potential and certainly seems to be becoming a magnet for families to come here. And so again, I think as we look at the cost of this, we need to take a hard look at this particular law.
I've seen press reports where you've been quoted or statements have been issued by you in your campaign that sort of imply the law should be repealed. Is that not your position, or?
Yeah, I think we need to, look, I think we need to repeal the law, or at the very least, those kinds of things. It starts the conversation on what we're spending and how we might even be able to fix it. Look, I'm not opposed to fixing it. And I think it would be simple language where you could put that, it is eligible only to citizens. I mean, certainly I have constituents. I can tell you, I'm just dealing with a constituent now in Southbridge who has worked for many years in the human services industry. She's worked with a number of people, and she finds herself homeless. She finds herself in a shelter. So we're certainly compassionate to those, but I think either an outright repeal or even just some modifications that put some parameters around who this law can affect is appropriate. So when we start the conversation, certainly starting the conversation off with a repeal may seem extreme on one end, but I do think it starts the conversation off.
Evan, why don't you take that conversation in a
Well, I'm glad you asked the follow-up, because I was going to say, that the first set of comments, it's hard to disagree with. Should we take a harder look at policies? Yeah, we should always take a harder look at policies. Should we assess the impact and see if it's having the effects we want it to have? Yeah, for sure we should assess the impacts and see what's going on. But there's a big difference from that to saying, yeah, we should repeal it before we even know really what the impact is. And my sense is that there's really very little evidence that the promise of shelter for families is pulling people into the state. What it's doing and what it has always been in place to do is make sure that children aren't on the streets. Like, when you talk about compassion, it's a very concrete example of what it means to be compassionate in our housing system in Massachusetts. That's why this right to shelter is limited to families and pregnant women, because the idea is for children. Like, there are just some baselines, some kind of baseline rules that we live by, regardless of the consequences, at least within reason. And one of them is like, we don't let kids get stuck on the streets. We find them places to live. Mm-hmm. And I think, that's the impulse here. And it would take to me anyway, and I think to a lot of voters, it would take a lot of evidence, contrary evidence about unintended consequences and dire implications to force a rethinking of that and say, no, you know what? We should let kids be stuck on the streets. We should let families be homeless. And I don't see anything approaching that kind of evidence in this case.
But I think, Evan, I don't think the representative's trying to say he doesn't want people homeless on the streets. At least he wants to.
No, yeah, for sure. No one's going to stand up and say, actually, what I want is kids on. No, of course. But that's the implication. Like,
but I guess I'm wondering,
if you give them shelter, you don't give them shelter, and if you don't give them shelter, well, then they're on the streets. Like that's right. How we ended up here.
But I guess I want to just push you a little bit on the notion that this has not been a magnet, if you will. Certainly the governor, in announcing an emergency, sort of raised that issue that we need some relief from Washington to deal with this problem. There is I don't think anyone is keeping any data on this, so that makes it problematic. But it seems like...
But I don't think anyone has cited any evidence for it, right? Like, if you're going to make the claim that our right to shelter law is increasing immigration into our state, you would have to say relative to other states nearby. But you know what? Lots of other states are seeing their shelter systems overwhelmed, are seeing rises in homelessness. That's not unique to Massachusetts. We are one of many states in the Northeast and border states. So no, there's no uniqueness there. And yes, I think we really need to separate here. Is our shelter system facing strains and potentially overwhelmed? For sure. And we need to address that. But is the reason for that because unauthorized immigrants are talking to each other about what a sweet deal they get in Massachusetts? No, or at least there's not a shred of evidence that that is the reason. The reason is asylum claims have gone up a lot. So there are a lot of people that are crossing to the US in legal, semi-legal ways. Border states have gotten creative about ways to get these people out of their states and into other parts of the country. They're giving them bus tickets, they're flying them around, right? They're trying to move people around. And so that has sort of changed the dynamics. But is right to shelter central to this? Again, I don't think so. And I'm more than that, I don't see anybody giving a reason to think so.
Representative?
But I guess my response to that is, I agree. We need to find that evidence, and we don't seem to be looking for it. So the lack of evidence may not be there. But the fact of the matter is we need to look at it. And I think that as we look at this policy, I mean, clearly it's just simply human nature, right? If you're going to be given something, I think one of the problems that we're seeing is that we don't actually know who's coming across the border. We don't know if they're families. We don't know the family unit even. So we have a gap of a lot of information coming from the border. I just think that, we can certainly have this conversation, and I can appreciate the fact that we may not see any evidence, but the fact that we're not looking for it, and we've asked the Healy administration for this information and have been stonewalled on it. So I just don't know that anybody's looking.
So what evidence have you asked for, if you could be a little more specific about that? Because that sounds like a key issue about how to deal with this problem.
Yeah, so we want to know. We want to know how many families, and we want to know where they're going, what the costs of this are, where they're being housed, so that we can start to get an idea as to who these folks are. Again, we're not seeing that. We can't assess these shelters. We can't assess whether or not they're family units, what that family unit makes up. Are we just seeing families only? Are they just pregnant women? I mean, I know it sounds good, but we don't know.
Okay, so you think that I hate to say it this way, but a regular homeless person might be being admitted to the shelters in contravention of the laws.
I'm saying it's possible. I'm saying it's possible, and we owe it to ourselves, and we owe it to the people of Massachusetts, and even to, especially to those who are looking for housing. We owe it to them to understand this problem, and we need to understand it in a minute detail, because this is costing us. We hear $45 million a month, but the costs are exponentially more than that. That may be what you're paying for some hotel rooms, and I would still argue that that is a very low number. But we are also feeding them 3 meals a day. We're giving them EBT cards. They're eligible for mass health. There is just an enormous amount of money that is going out the door that we have no idea how much it is. And so if we're not taking a hard look and really digging into this, we're doing everybody a disservice.
Representative, comment Evan made about this is happening in states all across the country. In some, it's more of a pronounced problem than others, I would guess. But you do hear this is happening in other states as well. Is the fact that what do you think? Is the fact that we have this law sort of a neon sign come here, or is it we just have a different law on how to respond to it?
No, I do think, again, I think that's kind of an interesting way to put it, a neon sign, but I do think, for lack of a better term, it is. We have seen this over the years with our generous welfare state here in Massachusetts. You are seeing this in some of the cities that would be considered sanctuary cities. They are magnets. And look, I mean, other cities may have the same problem, but or other states may have the same problem, but quite frankly, they're not my problem. Massachusetts is what I want to focus on. We know that, potentially millions of people are coming across the border. Well, I mean, hopefully they're not all coming to Massachusetts. They're being spread around, but that does not negate the fact that we have a serious problem here. So, not to sound real callous about it, but I'm not really concerned about other states. I'm concerned with what's happening here.
Evan?
I just don't think you can really understand what's happening here unless you look at what's happening in other states. And I'll just put this kind of more directly. If we have hung out a neon sign, that sign's been up for 40 years. And it's weird that we're experiencing an acute problem right now that is different than the problem has been for the other 39 and a half years, right? I don't think this explanation really holds water, which again is not to say that, the requests that the representative is talking about for more information about who's using the shelter system for how long, these are all reasonable requests and necessary for really understanding what is going on. Because it's not like I'm here saying, oh, I have the actual explanation for what's going on, right? I do think we need more assessment of this and better data. The story I have in my head is really that this is mostly driven by housing prices. That is, housing prices have gotten so out of control. Not that people who have crossed into the country and made asylum claims or come here are suddenly unable to afford housing. Probably they were struggling before. Lots of them don't have work authorization, but they could tap into a community when they got here of people who came from the same country or relatives, whatever it is. And those people had housing and probably could afford slightly bigger housing because housing was more affordable. And the less affordable it gets, the harder it is to tap into those networks and find places to stay, find people who will take you in, find a bed, find a family member, right? That becomes impossible when housing costs have gotten out of control. So, that's sort of how I've been thinking about it. But again, that also is, not as firmly rooted in evidence as I would want it to be.
Well, and I think Evan just unpacked a couple of things, and I think they're important. The fact that it hasn't been a problem for 39 and a half years is we haven't had an unchecked border for 39 and a half years.
Oh, but we have for a long time. Like, this is not the first time in America, in recent American history, we've had large numbers of people crossing the border. That's been a consistent thing for 20 years.
It's been consistent. I don't know that I would say to this level it's been that consistent. This is really unprecedented, the number of people that are coming across this border. So it's clearly the reason why we're seeing that. Now, I will also agree with Evan that the housing crisis here in Massachusetts is real. But you bring up a good point, which is that those who came prior, and again, this goes back to the days of Ellis Island. Right? Those who came here had sponsors. They had family. They came knowing that there weren't a lot of social safety nets for them to partake in, but they came here to make their own way and to work. And I don't necessarily disagree with you, Evan. We have we can unpack another topic, which is the shortage of labor here in Massachusetts and around the country, where we have a lot of businesses looking for work, and we apparently have a pool of people waiting to work. But again, those are federal issues that we can't deal with on this level. So I think there's a few things that we need to talk about. But if we're talking about, first of all, that this law's been no problem for the past 39 years, I think that's a little bit missing the mark, because we have not had this level of people crossing the border for 39 years. Secondly, housing, 100%. We need more housing. And to me, that's just simply a supply and demand issue. We need to build more. That's a whole other issue that we can move in. And then the issue of jobs is something else. We have a pool of people. Perhaps they can fill some of those jobs, but it has to, again, be done properly. We cannot be taking jobs away from those who are here legally, from those who have work permits, from those who are citizens.
So let's push forward a little bit, maybe to get a level playing ground for a discussion here. You both sort of say we need more data.
Yeah.
Is it that hard to get? Who's participating in this emergency shelter program? Where are they coming from? Is I would assume that is available somewhere. I don't know myself. What do you guys think?
I mean, my assumption is yes, that administrative data is kept and is available. Now, I'm a little bit uncertain about it because, as someone who has worked with housing data before, a lot of housing data is distributed across agencies in the cities and towns and never centralized. So, for instance, we tried to get data about people using housing vouchers. And there is no central database of that. Nobody has that data. It is split in a way that is really baleful for good research. So it's possible that this data is also split and nobody has it centralized. But my guess is that no, there's good administrative data, and it's a question of getting a hold of it.
Well, and I'm going to defer to Evan on this, because I think here he's the guy who gets this data and analyzes it and things like that. But I would agree, this data should exist. If it's not there, we need to compile it, and we need to put some effort forward to do that, because again, only with this data are we able to make those kind of decisions that are appropriate. And until we have it, we're kind of just wandering around in the dark.
You both agree that this is a housing issue in a broad sense. I'm struggling a little bit with that. I'm not disputing that it is a housing issue, but we seem to have so many housing issues right now. We have, there's not enough this type of housing, there's not enough that type of housing, there's just not enough of all types of housing. And it's this issue of sort of emergency shelter, in my mind, I have a little hard time explaining how, I guess if there was more housing, then more people would be moving into that housing. There might be less, more space for emergency situations. Is that what you were?
Yeah, so I'll take this on, because I think my sense of the connection between the housing crisis and the shelter crisis is even stronger than the representative sense. I think, like, at root, this is rainfall from the housing crisis, right? This is fall-on consequence of that. And yes, it is in a world of housing abundance. Then when you come, there are people who have extra rooms because they can afford it, and those people are more willing to take in people who come into our state. There are people in your community who have extra rooms, and they can say, oh yes, for a short while we can house somebody. Or there are just more vacant places, and the state can pay for those vacant places and say, okay, for temporary use we'll have here. Or the state can, if the zoning issues were changed, the state could say, you know what, we're going to build a new facility, we're going to build a new shelter, we're going to build more affordable housing, but zoning is preventing that. So I think this is really one of the kind of trickle-down impacts of the tight housing market. And unfortunately, I don't think there is a solution. So the one example where we do have really good data is about homelessness. People think that homelessness is strongly tied to things like mental illness, or it's strongly tied to things like weather. Why wouldn't you go to a warm place versus a cold place? But the evidence is really clear that the best predictor of homelessness rates is housing prices. When housing prices are high, homelessness goes up. And in places where housing prices are high, homelessness is higher. And you might not think like, well, these people are really at the kind of tail of economic security. Maybe they're sort of separate from the housing market. But no, it makes a huge difference to those up and down the income ladder what the stock of housing is like and what the price of housing is like. And I think that's what we're seeing in the shelter system, just like we see it in homelessness.
That's interesting. Representative, what's your take?
Well, I push back a little bit. I think the idea that if people just had more rooms, they'd house folks. So we'll take in a family. I mean, we've seen the administration say that if you've got an open room, take in a family, and I don't think people are rushing to take in strangers into their home. I mean, that's just human nature. If people are not going to just say, oh, well, yeah, send a family over my way. So I think I kind of push back on that a little bit. The issue of housing to me is relatively simple. Maybe simple in theory, but more complex in administration. But it's just a supply and demand issue. We need to build more housing. And I think we see, even if we look at the number of housing starts in Boston, that number has dropped precipitously, mainly. And I think, Evan, you may or may not push back on it, but what we're seeing is in Boston, those housing starts and those condo starts have all started to drop because Mayor Wu and others have started pushing rent control again. And nobody wants to build housing if you're going to tell me how much I have to pay for this or how much I have to rent this particular apartment out for. So to me, we need to incentivize and allow developers to build and build on a very large scale. In Boston, that means high rises. In the suburbs, it means smaller houses. Lot sizes can be smaller, things of that nature. So there are some zoning issues that come into effect there. But to me, I think that's what's going on. But the idea that, if we just had more housing, then these folks living in shelters would be in them may or may not be true. But the folks who are coming over the border, do they have the ability to buy a house? Do they have cash in their pockets? Can they get loans? I would say the answer to that is no. And so just simply having more houses and then the people can come across the border and have them is just another cost to the government as well, cost to all of us. So I think there's a few things to unpack there, but to me, on the housing crisis, we have to build more units on a massive scale, and that means loosening up those requirements for builders.
Okay, well, it's interesting. Evan, I don't know if you have something you want to add there. I'll give you a chance, but I wanted to sum up here, if unless you do.
Well, I'll just say a last thing, because I do think the homelessness example is a good example, because I think you could try to make the argument the representative made, which is, yeah, if we had cheaper housing, do you really think people who are homeless would be able to get jobs and get housing? It seems kind of far-fetched. And yet all the evidence suggests that's exactly what happens, right? There are mechanisms when housing is cheap for homelessness to go down and people who you would think are sort of outside the job market to get stable shelter. And so I don't see why this logic wouldn't also apply. In fact, I'm pretty convinced it would also apply in the case of the shelter population. But in some ways, it doesn't really matter. It doesn't really matter, because the representative and I are agreeing basically that you need to build more housing. Like, whether my theory is right or not, we're not actually fighting about this. And I'm certainly not going to blame the mayor. But I do think that zoning across the state, zoning regulations have a huge impact on how much we build and where we're building. And there's also some supply constraint. But anyway, I do think the housing crisis is really what stands behind the current shelter crisis, more so than what's going on at the border or with right to shelter.
Yeah, so, and I don't necessarily disagree but I don't necessarily agree with it either. I think it's being exacerbated by those coming across the border. We had a housing crisis before that occurred. We needed more housing before that's occurred. So, the interesting thing here is, and Bruce, I really want to thank you for this, because you're seeing myself and Evan, we can agree on 80% of these issues. How to solve them, I think we can probably also come to agreements on. So I think this is a really important discussion to have as we go forward. So yeah, this is good.
I'll agree also on thanking you, Bruce. That's
well, I tend to agree, because I thought it was going to start out in one area, and now we've ballooned into even a much more complicated subject, if that's possible. So, and I appreciate that. That's the way most issues go in the end, I think.
But I do, like I say, I do have some pushback. I think those people that are coming here, that are coming across the border, they're coming across illegally. I think it's just a horrible crisis it's a humanitarian crisis. It's a crisis to our country, and I do think I mean, I just can't help but think about human nature. And when we provide free housing, free food, free medical care, who wouldn't want to do that? And so it's just logic that's going to drive this population to find those things, especially if they understand that to begin with. I don't think bringing them here when they have no means of support, when they have no sponsors, I don't think it's likely that they're going to go and find their own housing. I don't know what the solution is. We've rented these hotel rooms now. They're under a contract for a year or 2 years. I think it's been a year contract with an extension on many of them. Well, if they can't work, where are they going to get money? So I don't see the end game here of where these folks are going, barring action from the federal government, which is to kind of issue a blanket work permit for people. This is not going away. And the fact that the state is having to pay for this and the taxpayers are having to pay for this, there seems to be no end in sight, nor a desire for an end in sight.
Well, perhaps, but at the same time, this is sometimes the way debates start, and some sort of consensus is reached because it becomes costly and becomes expensive, and human nature is such that until I'm very familiar with it, until there's a deadline, until there's a crunch, it often doesn't get done. But
it's kind of a lousy way to make policy, isn't it? Can we all agree on that?
Well, you're from the legislature. You should know better than anybody about how they often leave things to the last minute. So
true.
At any rate, I want to thank Representative Peter Durant, Republican from Spencer, for joining me today, along with Evan Horowitz, the Executive Director of the Center for State Policy Analysis at Tufts University. Thank you both. And to our listeners, we'll see you again next week. Thank you.